Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. And on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, I'd like to welcome you to our Thurgood Marshall Award ceremony, honoring the lives and legacies of two American icons, Congressman John Lewis and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'd like to say thank you to the members of our board that are with us today, including our board chairman, Ambassador Tom Pickering, our vice chair, Pamela Scholl, and trustees Greg Platts, Julia Nickles, Bryan, Gary Wilson, and former member of the House of Representatives from Michigan, Chairman Mike Rogers. This past year provided a dramatic stress test for our national fabric. The COVID-19 pandemic and economic freefall tested the ability of our politics and our people to meet a once-in-a-century threat. Gross civil rights violations and the worst civil unrest in half a century tested our society's ability to come to terms with a history of systemic racial injustice. And a tumultuous presidential campaign and post-election period marred by unfounded allegations of widespread voting fraud, tested our democracy. In the midst of this challenging year, we lost two great American icons. About 10 years ago, when I served as a member of Congress representing Southeast Virginia, I had the great honor of being able to walk the same House floor with Congressman John Lewis, and to be able to share in serving our home state of Virginia with my friend, Congressman Bobby Scott, who's with us today. The most interesting conversation I had this past year in January of 2020 was certainly the few moments I had to share in conversation with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, where we talked about the fact that the Virginia state legislature had just made Virginia the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And I had a great opportunity to talk with Justice Ginsburg about her life's work on equal rights and the prospects for the future of the Equal Rights Amendment. But we're very pleased to have you all with us today to talk about these two great icons. Representative Bobby Scott, the chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee, is joining us, and we'll discuss the life of Mr. John Lewis. And we will also have a conversation with Ms. Nina Totenberg, the NPR Legal Affairs correspondent, shortly after that. At this point in time, I'd like to recognize CSPC's board vice chair and president of the Dr. Scholl Foundation, Ms. Pamela Scholl, for a welcome.
Thank you, Glenn. Good evening to all of my fellow board members, our guests, Ms. Totenberg, Chairman Scott, and all of you joining us this evening. Albeit virtually, it's still a pleasure to welcome you to this event to honor two great leaders, their lives, their impact, and their calls to action that will echo forever. As an organization looking at the lessons of history, it's fitting that our inaugural Thurgood Marshall Award go to Justice Ginsburg and Congressman John Lewis. First, in choosing to name the award after Thurgood Marshall to accompany our Publius, Eisenhower, and Hamilton awards, we hope to remind ourselves and inspire future generations that America's continued success requires not only compromise, security, and prosperity, but also justice. In America, we are lucky to be in a nation ruled by its people, but the heart of a nation can only be as strong as the heart of its people. The lives of Justice Ginsburg and Congressman Lewis were dedicated to strengthening our hearts so that all could partake in what our nation has to offer, and thus bring America closer to its potential. Justice Ginsburg, like many of us, knew what Me Too meant long before it was a hashtag. And while John Lewis lived a life that spanned choruses of "We Shall Overcome" to chants of "Black Lives Matter," the story of their lives demonstrates to us that lasting change comes not only from the power of advocacy, but also the hard work of governance and institutional building, while practicing the art of compromise and the grace of civility. It's now my pleasure to introduce our awards video to tell us more about these great Americans' lives and how we continue to strive for America to meet the promise of its founding ideals.
No nation in history has ever been founded upon such high ideals as the United States of America. Our founding fathers understood that all men are created equal, that sound moral government is answerable to the people, and the human condition should be based on more than simple birthright. These principles were so pure and just that the entire American experience has been an unfolding process of trying to catch up and live them out more fully. We have always been a work in progress, striving to create a more perfect union. Today, the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress is proud to recognize two pioneers who found faults in the American character and worked to repair them. Two courageous leaders who broke through barriers to advance the American promise. Two individuals our nation lost this year, but who left a legacy that will last for generations. Representative John Robert Lewis of Georgia and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Joan Ruth Bader was born just 13 years after a woman's right to vote was enshrined in the 19th Amendment. Today, it seems inconceivable that women were denied such rights as recently as 100 years ago. But this reality deeply impacted young Ruth as she set out to make a difference. Shortly after graduating from Cornell University, as the highest-ranking female in her class, Ruth Bader married Martin Ginsburg. 2 years later, as one of only 9 women to enroll at Harvard Law School in a class of over 500, a professor reportedly asked why she was taking the place of a man. Later, she transferred to Columbia and again graduated at the top of her class. In the coming decades, she helped launch the first American law journal to focus exclusively on women's rights and co-founded the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU. As the group's general counsel, she won 5 out of the 6 cases she argued before the Supreme Court on gender discrimination and was called the Thurgood Marshall of that cause. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter appointed Ginsburg to a seat on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and in 1993, President Bill Clinton nominated her to become only the second woman and the first Jewish woman to serve on the United States Supreme Court. In that time, Justice Ginsburg became a cultural icon and a stalwart for equal rights. She fought for gender equality and voting rights and was known as an outspoken dissenter on critical issues. Upon her death on September 18, 2020, Chief Justice John Roberts said, "Today we mourn, but with confidence that future generations will remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg as we knew her, a tireless and resolute champion of justice." Just 2 months earlier, in July 2020, America lost another pioneer who also spent his life trying to help our nation live up to our founding principles. John Robert Lewis was born in 1940 into the Jim Crow South. He dreamed of being a preacher and experienced firsthand the pain of segregation and racism. At the age of 15, young John Lewis heard Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the radio and discovered what would become his life mission. As a student, John Lewis began organizing sit-ins at segregated diners and believed it was important to engage in what he called good trouble, necessary trouble. He became one of the original Freedom Riders and was named chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In 1963, he helped organize the March on Washington with Dr. King. and on the day known as Bloody Sunday, he led more than 600 marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where they were met with a violent response from police. He was attacked with a nightstick and left with a fractured skull. Ultimately, John Lewis would build on these and other experiences to become one of the great statesmen of our time, fighting for human dignity and civil rights while serving the state of Georgia for 17 terms in the United States House of Representatives. He was known to many as the conscience of the Congress and reminded us, ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or presidential term. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe even many lifetimes. And each one of us in every generation must do our part. 2020 will long be remembered for the health, economic, social, and political crises which are remaking human society. But we simply cannot allow this year to close without pausing to remember two great American souls whose very lives have shown us that together we shall indeed overcome. It is in this spirit that the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress is proud to present the 2020 Thurgood Marshall Award to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Representative John Robert Lewis.
Great. At this time, I'm going to have a conversation with Congressman Bobby Scott, who's joining us from Virginia, and very pleased to have him. Congressman, it's a real pleasure to be with you again. Thank you for agreeing to share some moments and some reflections with us. I think one of the themes of our discussion so far has been that 2020 was a tumultuous and challenging year, even setting aside the loss of Congressman Lewis and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's just been a heck of a year. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this year in a few moments. But first of all, let me say to you, congratulations on your recent reelection, both to your House seat and also to your chairmanship of the Education and Labor Committee. Really glad you're in those positions. But maybe we can start by just going back in time a little bit and asking you to tell us about your first experience with John Lewis. How did you meet him? How did you get to know him? What were your sort of early memories of that relationship like?
Well, Glenn, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I want to congratulate Ruth Bader Ginsburg and John Lewis for these awards. You asked when I first met John. I've known him so long now. I don't really remember when I met, but I got to really know him when I first got elected to Congress after the 92 election, and served with him not only as a member of Congress, but more particularly as a member of the Congressional Black Caucus that meets every Wednesday that we're in session. So I got to know him extremely well as a member of the Black Caucus, and over the years, I got to benefit from his expertise, his wisdom, but just knowing that he's in the room. There are few people that walk the kind of moral authority that he has. You just know from his history what he's been through, and his life story, and it's just an inspiration to everybody to know that there are people that can go through what he has been through, and still keep fighting the good fight.
I think when, in my recollection, whenever John Lewis spoke in the House of Representatives, there was kind of a quiet on both sides of the aisle, the likes of which you didn't get from almost anybody else who could speaking before the House of Representatives, which was quite striking. I want to ask you a little more about how he balanced his roles. And we took our internship class last summer to the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall. And one of our international interns told us that she was really surprised to see that one of the men in a young man in the photo of the march on Washington from 1963 was still at that time a serving member of Congress. And I'm interested in your thoughts on, Congressman, on how John Lewis balanced that responsibility of both being an historic civil rights icon and also a current member of Congress.
Well, first of all, a lot of the history of the South isn't that long ago, and a lot of the legislation that's passed that's kind of cured many of the ills was actually voted on by people that you and I served with. So John Lewis was elected in 1986 to serve Georgia from the 5th Congressional District, but it wasn't his first role as a national figure. In '61, as you pointed out, he was a student at Fisk University and volunteered to participate in the Freedom Rides, which challenged segregation in the interstate bus terminals across the South. He risked his life several times by sitting in the seats that were supposed to be reserved for whites. He helped form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was one of the major civil rights organizations at the time, and served as chairman from '63 to '66. And he also was an organizer and served as one of the keynote speakers at the historic March on Washington in August of 1963. So he had all of that background going into the 1965 march from across Edmund Pettus Bridge. He was brutally beaten, as the video showed, by on that march. And interestingly enough, every year for the past many years, at least a decade, maybe two, he would lead a congressional delegation to the Edmund Pettus Bridge so that we could reenact that march. And the number of members of Congress that attended that grew and grew and grew to the fact till the 50th anniversary, when President Obama joined the group, and we had probably 150 members of Congress participate in that reenactment. But through the remainder of the 1960s, he helped to coordinate voter registration drives and community action programs in various leadership positions and capacities. In 1977, in fact, President Jimmy Carter appointed him to direct more than 250,000 volunteers in action, which was at the time the Federal Volunteer Agency. In '81, he converted his activism into an elected position. He was elected to the Atlanta City Council, where he was an advocate for ethics in government and neighborhood preservation. In '86, he ran for Congress to represent Georgia's 5th District, and that includes Atlanta and some surrounding counties. And while in Congress, he continued the fight for civil rights, equal rights, particularly voting rights. And it was a true voice of reason and was referred to, as the video pointed out, as the conscience of Congress. His public service reflected his character, warm, optimistic man who welcomed others into Congress, mentored new lawmakers, and believed in the power of forgiveness and redemption. It's worth noting that one of the members of that mob who attacked John during the original march came to Capitol Hill to apologize, and it was his conviction that won him admirers, but his spirit of reconciliation and bipartisanship that changed people's minds and got things done in Washington. And so you can see just from his life story, he converted his activism into an elected position, and just showed throughout his entire service that he viewed voting as the real method of change, making sure people had the right to vote, and then as an elected official, converting those votes into action.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I remember watching, I think honestly, one of the saddest moments of this year for me was watching the ceremony of the funeral procession for John Lewis across, you mentioned the Edmund Pettus Bridge and his return there. Watching that ceremony, and it was a sad moment, but I also felt like there must be some glimmer of positivity or hope in that symbolic passage. And I'm wondering if you might share any thoughts on. I mean, this has been a hard year. We lost John Lewis. You know, we've had COVID. It's just been a tough year for a lot of families. Are you feeling hopeful at all about the future next year? Are there things that John Lewis taught us that, you know, that can give us a little bit of hope in this kind of dark time?
Well, he, as you kind of alluded to in his speeches and in his service as a member of Congress, he had an optimism that if people voted, we could make change. And that optimism never waned. He would always give the most enthusiastic speeches of anybody when he gave speeches, and it was just that optimism and just a sense that he's going to do the right thing. You know, when you're in Congress, you've got a lot of pressures going this way and that way, and it's sometimes unclear what you ought to do. He didn't have any problem knowing what to do. He's going to do the right thing. And if it came to voting, he knew exactly what needed to be done, and he would say what needed to be done, even if it got him in good trouble. He would make sure that the right thing was done. And from that perspective, he served as a role model of what how people ought to be guided in Congress.
Let me ask you about that issue of being a role model and your personal kind of connection. You occupy a number of sort of positions of first in Virginia, including being the first African American representative from the Commonwealth since Reconstruction when you were elected to Congress in 1993. John Lewis had already been in office for 6 years at that point. You mentioned serving in the Congressional Black Caucus together. But can you reflect at all on sort of that notion of moral clarity and leadership and anything that he helped teach you as a young member of Congress?
Well, one of the things he taught was just a spirit of optimism that things are going to work out. You just keep working at it, things are going to work out. I worked with him on a number of bills, the Voting Rights Act. I served on the Judiciary Committee, and the Voting Rights Act reauthorization came before our committee. Other bills like the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act of 2008 came before our committee, and obviously he was in the middle of that. I was also worked on that. I introduced the Youth Promise Act for several years. It's a simple piece of legislation, a grant program that would provide comprehensive grants for communities that had comprehensive programs to get young people on the right track and keep them on the right track, rather than the normal crime strategy as you wait for young people to mess up, and then you jump up on a soapbox and argue about how much time they're going to get. Make the investments ahead of time and have a comprehensive program, not just one little program in the 3rd grade or the 12th grade. Have a program that starts with teen pregnancy prevention and prenatal care, getting young people on the right track and keeping them on the right track so they never get in trouble to begin with. And following his guide and model, that bill never saw the light of day until I became ranking Democrat on the Education Committee and had the ability to sneak things into various pieces of legislation. So the bill itself never became law, but the provisions of the bill can be found in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. The next challenge, of course, is to get it funded. Under this administration, we haven't been able to get funds for it. But next year, I fully expect that bill to get to get funded, and for comprehensive bills to be, comprehensive programs to be funded. And it's the kind of stick-to-itiveness and optimism that John exuded that kept me going and making sure that I didn't lose hope in getting that legislation passed. So next year, we'll have funding, and young people will have the benefit of that legislation.
That's great, getting some progress on a key issue. Can I ask you about voting rights? Because you mentioned the power of voting, the fundamental basic power of voting rights to help transform and move the country forward, and that being a kind of key position of John Lewis's. But it feels like, I mean, voting rights is not something that's static. It is something that has to be promoted, defended, protected, pushed all the time. And it feels like this year particularly, voting has just come under attack in a way that is even more vociferous than in normal years. And I'm wondering for your thoughts on where are we going with voting rights, and how are we going to get out of this? We seem to be in a pretty bad mode right now when it comes to the general consensus on the importance of letting everybody vote. And maybe it's just a pandemic thing. Maybe it's just a momentary political thing. What are your thoughts on the future for that?
Well, regrettably, it has become political, and Democrats have an open policy strategy called GOTV, Get Out the Vote, and we promote voter registration and turning out the vote, and we feel that's good for Democrats, and it's no secret. That's a known strategy. Regrettably, it's gotten to the point where many Republicans have an open and no longer secret strategy of suppressing the vote every different kind of way they can, legislatively, administratively, in litigation, everything they can do to suppress the vote, because they have concluded that the fewer people vote, apparently it's better for them. And you see it in legislation. And it's targeted to minority communities. One appellate court decision pointed out in North Carolina, for example, the restrictive voting laws that they passed. They use the word surgical precision in targeting the African American community. They went through every different kind of change in the law that could restrict voting. They evaluated, they actually did studies to see what effect it had on different racial communities. And all of those that suppressed the African American vote, they passed. The others, they did not pass. So this had nothing to do with the sanctity of the vote or the security of the vote. This is just a targeted impression. You see the voter purges. You see other kinds of strategies in the litigation, and you see it in the litigation in before the 2020 November election. Every suit filed, you had the Republicans trying to restrict the people that could vote, and the Democrats trying to open the doors to voting. And so voter suppression has become a political strategy, which is very regrettable. In Virginia, we've seen it, where the Republicans passed restrictive laws, and when Democrats took over the General Assembly with the Democratic governor, a lot of those were eliminated, and in fact, voter opportunities were expanded. We had no excuse absentee voting, which is essentially early vote, which is something that most states had routinely had. Virginia had for the first time. And we've seen a significant increase in turnout because of the ability to early vote in Virginia. But it has regrettably become a partisan issue. I would think that at some point, a critical mass of Republicans are going to become embarrassed about the fact that their party is associated with racially oriented voter suppression, and start taking the position that they're not going to have any part of it. We've seen some in this past election. We've seen some election officials regrettably have to stand up heroically and face political opposition from their own party when they stand up to the idea that they're going to count the votes and report the totals as they see them, without giving in to pressure to change the results after the election.
Right.
It's refreshing, because had they not, the entire democratic experiment would have been at risk. John Lewis spent his life's work making sure that people had the right to vote, that they could freely exercise that right, and that the legislative process would reflect the will of the election. I think he would be disappointed with some of the shenanigans that went on before the election and after the election, but I think he would be heartened to know that the democratic process has withstood the kind of pressure that's been applied. You've had the President of the United States calling local election officials in Michigan and in Georgia. Officials have been getting calls from the White House or other officials in Washington, and they've stood their ground. Pennsylvania, people have gotten calls, but they've stood their ground and said, no, we're going to count the votes and we're going to report what we see. And that is, I think John would be very happy to see that take place, and they did not capitulate to political pressure and let somebody steal an election.
If he were here with us today, what do you think John Lewis would say he would want his legacy to be?
I think he knows what his legacy is. He has a lifetime. His entire life experience has been to as the legacy that the right to vote is precious and needs to be maintained. And if you have to get in good trouble to maintain that vote, so be it. If you see something, you have to do something. And his legacy is the example of how you should treat that the vote as precious. People are entitled to exercise the vote. It shouldn't be toyed with. It shouldn't be suppressed. It's something it's a basis of democracy, and how we have the great country we have. It's because of the vote. Not only the right to vote, but as his life experience has shown, you need to have the right to vote. You also need elected officials, and he transformed from the advocate just for voting to the elected official that advocated for the right to vote, but also advocated for the needs of his constituents.
You mentioned the famous term "good trouble" several times. I wanted to show you and show our audience a mask that a friend of mine in Norfolk, who's become a mask artisan, made in honor of this event and of John Lewis and what his life stood for. And Congressman, I sent you one of these over to your office, so I hope you wear it with pride. Let me ask you one more question, and that is, we want this event to be not just a reflection looking backward, but a call to action for ourselves, for our fellows, for all the participants that are joining us and that watch this award ceremony. So what do you think Mr. Lewis would tell us if we could speak to him today and asked him, how can we help? What can we do? What should we make sure to include in our lives and our work to ensure that his legacy lives on?
Well, I think if you just look at his life experience, you know what to do. Do the right thing, get in good trouble if that's necessary, but protect the right to vote. That is the fundamental basis of our democracy, the unfettered right to vote. And if anyone is disparaging that right, if anybody's undermining that right, you have to take action to protect the right to vote. And then not only vote, but participate in the electoral process, make sure the right people get elected, and make sure they're doing the right thing after they get elected. That was his life, fighting for the right to vote, in such getting in good trouble, standing up, speaking truth to power. He stood up, looking the state troopers in the eye without fear, because he knew he was on the right side. And that legacy will encourage others to make sure we stand up for the right to vote, and that we continue to protect it. We're going to have to pass legislation to restore the damage done by the Supreme Court in the Shelby Holder case, which sabotaged Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act by eliminating the Section 4, sabotage Section 5 pre-clearance, which was a very important part of the Voting Rights Act, the most important part. And so we still have work to do, but we have his legacy and his background and his encouragement to keep on keeping on.
Well, Chairman Scott, I think that's a great closing comment. Thank you so much, both for your career of service to the Commonwealth of Virginia and to the country, for sharing your thoughts and reflections. We can take hope knowing that people like you remain in office and are still fighting the good fight. And we won't forget that the onus is also on us to participate in that fight as well. So thank you so much for being with us.
And thank you for your honor to Congressman Lewis and for Justice Ginsburg.
Thanks so much. We were very proud to have the House Majority Whip, Mr. Jim Clyburn, submit some thoughts to us by video about the life of John Lewis. So we're going to go right now and take a look at the message from Mr. Clyburn.
Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this event honoring the life and legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and my late friend and colleague, John Robert Lewis. Now, my portion is to talk a little bit about John Lewis, what he meant to this Congress, this country, and to me personally. I first met John, we were both 19-year-olds. It was October 1960 on the campus of Morehouse College down in Atlanta, Georgia. He was a student then over in Nashville, and I was a student up in Orangeburg, and we came together to form what became known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And we adopted as our method of protest nonviolent disobedience of unjust laws. Now, all of us adopted nonviolence as a tactic, but for some reason, John Lewis was different, and he adopted nonviolence as a way of life. It became his life. He's one of the few people that I know that demonstrated time and time again his commitment to the protest movement of nonviolence. You may see behind me a figure of Mahatma Gandhi, who was I call the originator of the modern nonviolence movement. Martin Luther King picked it up, and John Lewis lived it out. He made a tremendous sacrifice on the day that he came upon the national conscience, on March 7th, I believe it was, 1965, walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge down in Selma, Alabama, protesting the voting laws of the time. At the time of that march, only 2% of African Americans in the entire state of Alabama were registered to vote. John and 599 others marched on that day. Many of them were beaten, John to near death. But 6 months later, August 6, 1965, Congress passed and the president signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That Voting Rights Act made it possible for him to come to this Congress, made it possible for me to come to this Congress. And today, of the 222 Democrats here in the House of Representatives, 59 of them are African Americans. We are here because of what John Lewis meant to the voting and community service. And we have just decided that we are going to pass a new Voting Rights Act to make whole once again that 1965 Act that has been rendered ineffective because of a Supreme Court decision in Shelby, Alabama versus Eric Holder. That case, the holding was written by Justice Roberts, and Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, said in the holding, he invited Congress to update the Voting Rights Act, and we're going to do that, and we're going to call it the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. And hopefully, it will once again restore those protections that John Lewis fought so hard for, protections that we have just seen the results in this past election. The voter suppression that's taken place that could not occur legally if we had that Voting Rights Act of 1965, and will not occur in the future if Congress were to pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. We're going to look forward to that happening next year and give forever life to the legacy of John Robert Lewis.
Well, it is indeed a real treat and a great honor for us to have that clip from the House Majority Whip, Mr. Jim Clyburn. In our next segment, we're going to look more closely into the life of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg with someone who knew her quite well as a personal friend, Nina Totenberg. Nina called us up earlier today and told us that the Supreme Court is in the middle of considering a critical case, presidential election related case, and was worried that she might be called away to report on this during this live segment. So she asked if we could record her remarks and reflections on Ruth Bader Ginsburg to display to you now. Please join me in enjoying a really riveting conversation between Nina Totenberg and CSPC's Vice Chair, Ms. Pamela Scholl.
Good afternoon, everyone. What a pleasure it is to have the honorable, wonderful Nina Totenberg with us here today. All of us know her voice and all the wonderful things she's done for NPR, but she's here for our inaugural CSPC Thurgood Marshall Award to talk about the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So we're delighted and thank you so much for your time to have a conversation with us today to talk about this legend of a woman and your dear friend. You met Justice Ginsburg, I understand, in the early 70s before she founded the Women's Rights Project and before the DC Court of Appeals and before she was on the Supreme Court. What did you think of her at that time? Did you feel like this was a force that was going to be reckoned with and she was going to have such an impact on our country?
Well, I think I would have had to have been more prescient than I was in my, I think I was probably in my 20s and she was in her 30s. And so we were both I would say very young. At this point in my life, I would say very young.
Yeah.
And I was newly assigned to cover the Supreme Court, and I didn't know what I was doing, to say the very least. So I was gobbling up information, and everything was new to me. So I opened this brief in a case called Reed versus Reed, which turned out to be the first time that the Supreme Court ruled ultimately that arbitrary discrimination based on sex was unconstitutional. And it was a case from Idaho involving a state law that automatically favored male executors of estates over female executors. And I'm reading this brief, and it says that women are covered by the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm 25, 6, something like that. And I'm thinking to myself, how can that be? I thought the 14th Amendment was to cover freed slaves and African Americans. And so I flipped to the front of the brief to see who the author was. I knew that much. And the author of the brief was a Rutgers law professor named Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I went to the telephone booth that we had then in the press room at the Supreme Court, which was about probably 3 feet square, if that. And I called Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she picked up her own phone, of course. And I told her my dilemma, and I got an hour-long lecture. And sometime later, we began talking on the phone regularly about cases that were coming up involving sex discrimination. And sometime later, I met her at a conference I went to, and neither of us could ever remember what it was about. Or let's put it this way, she had a different remembrance than I did. And it was so boring that we decided to leave and go shopping. So
That's a good connector. That's a great connector. That's fabulous. That's fabulous.
Increasingly over the years, we became first professional acquaintances, then professional friends, then personal friends, and ultimately very, very close personal friends.
So you knew, obviously you knew her husband, her family, her children, and the challenge she had just going through law school were incredible. Did she ever talk about those with you, with doing her work, helping her husband, raising a baby?
Well, as you know, there's a movie about all of
Right.
this called On the Basis of Sex, because
Sex.
Marty, besides everything else, got testicular cancer when they
Right.
were in law school and was subjected to huge doses of radiation. And she had to take care of her toddler, Jane, who was, I think, not even 2 years old yet, and her husband, and help him write his paper and take dictation from him, get notes from him. And she got on law review. I mean, Marty, who was a brilliant tax lawyer, always used to minimize his own gifts. And he would say things like, they met at Cornell. I majored in golf. She got every kind of academic award you could get. Or I was the non-existent, not important law student, and she made law review. When that's all true, but he was also a very brilliant lawyer himself.
I have friends that have worked with him and had the pleasure and just thought he was an incredibly wonderful man and very, very talented in his own right. But did she ever talk about what made her? I mean, sometimes when you're in the middle of a crisis, you keep going, you put one foot in front of another. But did she ever talk about, was it faith? What was it that just kept her head, focused, or what did relieve the stress for her in those times?
I'm not sure anything relieved the stress. Her
Right.
view was, up until the end of her life, you just put one foot in front of the other and do the best you can.
Right.
And in fact, she gave me the best personal advice I got from anyone, perhaps in my life, at least my adult life. When my late husband was terribly sick and was in the ICU, he'd fallen on the ice and had a major brain injury, and he was in the ICU for months. And I had been haunting the ICU a lot, and she would periodically scoop me up, take me out with Marty to an opera, to a dinner they were invited to, or to a dinner at their house with somebody interesting, to sort of get my mind off of things. And she said to me at some point relatively early on, she said, you know, you're not going to do him any good haunting the hospital. He needs to get better there, and there are people there to help him do that. Yes, you have to go. You have to make sure he understands you're with him all the way. But when he comes home, he is going to need you at full tilt strength, and you will have expended it all. So you should go to work, and you should do the best you can. It may not be the best work you've done, but it will still be good work. And when he comes home, you'll be a whole person ready to take care of him. And that turned out to be 100% true. And it was such wise advice for a professional woman struggling with a terribly difficult problem that she had clearly been through.
I think it's remarkable, but it is wonderful advice for the younger people that are listening today, because we all go through these trials through our life. It is part of life, but it's fabulous advice, and I hope you all take it to heart. You were also friends with Justice Scalia, as I understand.
Mm-hmm.
I did have the pleasure getting to know him through a family friend and one of my mentors, Morris Liebman, and Maury was one of my mentors as I was coming up through CSIS, and David Abshire and some of the other people on this program will know the name, but they were very close friends. And so even despite their disagreements and coming from different ends of the political spectrum or their viewpoints, how did they protect that beautiful friendship that is such a wonderful thing? And I saw it in my earlier days in Washington. We know everything is a little more polarized and uncivil, but this was the essence of civility and friendship.
Well, Nino was a really easy guy to love. I mean, he was so entertaining. He was so much fun. He was willing to, I didn't fight with him about constitutional issues because I'm not an idiot. So that's for starters. But he loved a good intellectual battle. And the best interview I think I maybe ever did was of the two of them together for about an hour and a half at least, or maybe 2 hours on the stage of Lisner Auditorium, not that long before he died, I think a year before he died. And they came to play. They teased each other. They told great stories about each other. And they engaged in civil combat about their ideas. And what came through, of course, was their respect for each other, even though they disagreed, and their understanding of how important it was to have that kind of respect on the Supreme Court. So one of the stories that Justice Ginsburg told often was that when she wrote her famous VMI decision saying that VMI could not exclude women who were qualified to be there, she had written it, she had circulated it, and Justice Scalia came to her chambers just as she was about to depart for a trip, I think, to the Second Circuit in New York. And he said, Ruth, I'm not entirely ready to circulate this because I want to, do some stylistic things, but I thought you should have it before you circulate her opinion, your opinion. I guess she had not circulated her opinion yet. You should have it before you circulate your opinion so that you can deal with my objections, because he really was the lone dissenter. And she took it with her on the trip and she said, it ruined my weekend. But it made the opinion much stronger because she had to deal with the best and the brightest objections. And as a result, she had to make her case even better. And you can see how annoyed she is at times by him and how annoyed he is at her in the footnotes. It's dueling footnotes. He even took her to task for saying that it was the, making a reference to the University of Virginia at its Charlottesville campus. And he did a footnote that said, there is no other campus. There is no at the Charlottesville campus. There is only the University of Virginia.
Oh, that's great. That's a great story. How did she feel? What did she think about her celebrity, which just grew and grew in recent years, and the notorious RGB, and it was wonderful. How did she feel about that? Was she?
Well, you know,
She seemed like such a humble person.
She certainly enjoyed it. And Marty used to tease her about her getting a fat head. You know, there's that famous story of them going into some theater in, I don't know, 2008 or 9, something like that. And she gets a standing ovation. And he whispers in her ear, you know, there's a convention of tax lawyers in town. So, but what's really interesting about it, and I don't really have the answer to this, is that her celebrity really reached its high points after she was an octogenarian, when she was in her 80s. And why that is, because let's face it, Ruth was a personally rather conservative person. I mean, I could go on and on about what she thought was appropriate behavior, for example.
Right.
And when you should maybe, to put this in terms that maybe people here will understand, you should ask the professor, could you have pass fail instead of a grade because you'd been sick or something? Her answer would have been never.
Right.
But she marveled at it and she enjoyed it. And I think it kept her going a lot. But I don't 100% understand why at that particular moment she became such a cultural icon. I have a theory. My theory, at least in part, is that there was something about her in that quiet, dignified little personage that was such a stand-up human being, willing to take anybody on in the most dignified of ways, but take them on. And she was incredibly culturally, in all ways, open to anything new. So if you go into the chambers of any Supreme Court justice on the court, you will see very traditional artwork, and they have the ability to get any artwork they want from the Smithsonian that's not on display and put it on their walls. Justice Sotomayor has a lot of Latin artwork, but by and large, it's very traditional. You go into her chambers, you went into her chambers, and it was very modern art. Sidney Pollack would have been old-fashioned to some of the things that she liked. So she was always open to new art, new music, and new ideas. I mean, I don't believe she ever married a gay couple until the court said it was okay.
Right.
But she definitely thought it was okay. And for somebody of her age, that was a fairly extraordinary thing. She hadn't come of age when that was so. And you asked me a little while ago, how did she keep going? The truth is that although she in many ways had a blessed life, she had a not easy life.
Right.
Her mother, for I think at least 8 years, had, I think it was ovarian cancer, but I'm not sure. I can't quite remember at the moment, and was dying for all of that time and was in terrible pain. But her mother was fierce about living for this child and giving her everything she could get. So she took her to operas. She gave her piano lessons. And this was not
Yeah.
a household that had a lot of money. She would read to her constantly and get her to read constantly. And if you look at some of the things that Ruth wrote when she was in grammar school about the UN and all kinds of things like that, when she's 10, 11, 12 years old, it's kind of amazing. And I do think that it was her mother who was the driving force in her life. I think her father had receded considerably because her older sister had died at a very, very early age. And I think he never quite got out of that depression. So the mother became the person who was her all-enveloping driving force and imbued her with those values that you just keep going.
And a wonderful sense of, for me, curiosity, which is a wonderful thing to have at any age.
There's a hilarious story, that that I have not told about her recently anyway. So she modeled herself trying to be a superwoman and a supermom
Right.
and all of that. But she takes Jane, then age 5, I think, to an opera at the Met, I believe. I'm not sure. But I think it was Così fan tutti, and which is not an opera that's easy to sit through. And Jane got up in the middle of the whole thing and did what she perceived she saw. She started screaming. So the next one they took her to, which for all I know was the Magic Flute, or maybe it was Così fan tutti. They played the record endlessly before they took her again.
That's wonderful. That is wonderful. Oh, an initiation, an unforgettable initiation to opera. One of my last questions is, she accomplished so much in her career. What do you think and we all know that there's always more work to do. What would be the next frontier, do you think, that she was thinking about ensuring equal justice is really going to become a reality for all Americans? Did she have any thoughts on that, or anything that you recall that you could share with us?
Well, I think her thoughts are in some of her dissents.
Right.
Where she was most unhappy with what the court had done. And she was always writing for a future generation, hoping that her dissents would become majority opinions, whether it was about voting rights or women's equality. And, I think she was very frank in acknowledging that most of the issues faced today by women are less, not that they aren't a question of equal opportunity, because sometimes they are, but they involve other questions. How does your role in child rearing affect your career? How does your employer deal with that, whether you're cleaning houses or offices or being a lawyer? And how does, sexual harassment play into things? How can women really have an equal footing, even though they are the child bearers and often bear the brunt of child raising. That's less true today than it used to be, but it's still true. And all you have to do is look at how many professional women are either struggling or have even left the workforce, at least
Right.
for a time, to deal with their children's education while they're learning on Zoom. That you can't just leave them at home on their own
No.
for the most part. And mothers who have to, in order to survive financially, see their children falling terribly behind. If they even have a broadband connection, and if they even have this thing.
Exactly. It's such a huge challenge, and so many people are struggling. Are there any, the last question, how is her family? How are her, I know they're grown children, but how is her family doing at this point?
They seem to be okay. But anybody who
Right.
is really close to her, I think, is, we all have our bad moments.
And you, yeah, you
Yeah.
as well. Yes.
If she came to our house for dinner every Saturday night for 24 straight weeks from the lockdown, almost to the point where she died. The last dinner we had together about 10 days before she died, we brought it to her at the apartment because she was feeling too weak to go. And I think that, you spent that kind of time. She was always my good friend. But this year, in some ways, was a gift for me and made her, the loss of my friend, that much more difficult. And then she had the bad form to die exactly a year and a day after my closest friend, probably, Cokie Roberts. So
Yes.
I had a sort of double whammy when she died, remembering
Right.
Cokie and remembering her.
Sure.
And it's, it doesn't go away instantly. It's like losing a sister.
Yes.
I know men have friendships. I still maintain that women have closer friendships. And losing a really close friend is a very hard thing. But she would have told us to just soldier on and to do our work, do the best work we could, and be satisfied with it and not dwell on this and move on. I think obviously she would have been very pleased that Joe Biden was elected and that Donald Trump was not. But she would not be pleased by what's going on right now. As
Right.
I'm assuming, I don't know this, as I'm assuming most of the court is not pleased. And it's the reason that we're doing this now instead of later.
I understand. Well, I wish you moments of happiness in your grief and only good memories of your dear friend, Justice Ginsburg.
It's not, I don't like calling it grief. It's it's a sadness, a loss. And, we all have losses in life and you just have to get through them. And she would be the first person to tell us that.
I lost my younger sister 2 years ago to cancer. So I understand that, but there's always that place in your heart that this person holds. And
you say, what would you do?
Right.
There are oftentimes when you say, I have conversations with Cokie too.
Yeah.
Okay, what should I do right now?
Right.
Should I do X or Y? And I sort of imagine her up there telling me,
exactly.
Giving me good advice. Fortunately, I also have sisters who give me good advice.
Yes.
But I check it out with Cokie and Ruth too.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful thing. Well, I'm so grateful for your time today and for speaking with us and being part of this program.
I do want to say one other thing,
Sure.
since we were just talking about women. Justice Ginsburg, when she was a lawyer, long before she was a judge and then a justice, really changed the way life is in the United States for women of my generation and yours and younger
Right.
generations who may not fully understand that, because I was always the first almost everywhere. I was the only almost everywhere. I fought off employers who put their, who tried to make passes at me and
Inappropriate.
inappropriate behavior. I thought I was alone, that didn't happen to other people. And there were thousands of laws, state, federal, and local laws that preferred men to women in all kinds of ways. Some of those laws were enacted to protect women, or so the male legislators thought. Oh, they shouldn't be working extra hours, etc. But she's really the person more than anybody else who was responsible for making those laws not there anymore. And she was the Thurgood Marshall for women, although, as she would be quick to point out, she was not Thurgood Marshall because her life wasn't at risk.
Right.
But for those of us who benefited, she drew the roadmap, made the strategy, which was a pretty conservative strategy because she had to deal mainly, almost exclusively, with male judges and older men, not just male judges, but older male judges. And that's why one of her favorite things was having male plaintiffs, like the guy whose wife died in childbirth,
Right.
and it didn't get the same Social Security benefits for his child, to raise his child that he would have gotten if he were a woman. Well, she got rid of that in a Supreme Court, very famous Supreme Court case. And so we take a lot of things for granted today. People who are in the foreign policy field, women in the foreign policy field, and you just look at who is on the various lists of everything expert, they wouldn't have been there 40 years ago when she started out. So
That's correct.
Or 50 years ago. So we have she is a great person to have as an icon, and not just a cultural icon, but a real icon.
And I'm hopeful that that's going to be a lasting thing with younger women and younger generations, that they appreciate what she did for all of us.
I hope so, but I know that fame is ephemeral.
Yeah.
Very ephemeral, especially in the modern era.
Well, we keep telling the story. We'll keep telling the story. That'll be part of our mission. Thank you again. I wish you the best for the holidays and New Year, and we appreciate your time today and being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
In just a moment, I'm going to invite CSPC trustee Julia Nickles Bryan to give us a final remark and a farewell for our event. But first, I'd just like to say once again, thank you so much to our speakers for participating in this awards event with us, for helping us to reflect on the lives and legacies of Congressman John Lewis and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and for helping us remember to recognize the legacy they've left in what has been a very difficult year, and to ensure that we didn't let this year end without properly recognizing their contributions. We have a new year ahead, so there's always room for hope. Thank you to our participants as well for joining us and taking on the charge to ensure that the legacies of these two great American icons live on in us, in our work and in the way that we approach our lives. So thank you all for being with us. It's been a great honor to host this event. And now I'd like to invite CSPC trustee Julia Nickles Bryan for closing remark.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you for this thoughtful program. Thank you, Ambassador Pickering, Vice Chair Pamela Scholl. Thank you, Chairman Scott, for your time and your insights. And we also extend our thanks to Representative Clyburn and Anita Totenberg. I'm honored to be a part of CSPC, an organization that takes the time to mark the passing and recognize the life of these two great Americans. Extraordinary champions, both of them, for justice and equality, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and John Lewis. In the tough year that 2020 has been, reflecting on Justice Ginsburg and Congressman Lewis gives us hope. They remind us that America is still a work in progress. Individuals can make a difference in making ours a more perfect union. May we be inspired by the lives they led and the legacy they leave behind as we continue our work. Thank you for joining us today. Be well, be safe, stay healthy.